The wind that tore through the high Bitterroot Range had teeth, and on this particular afternoon in late November, it bit deep enough to find the bone. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with a storm that had been brooding over the peaks for 2 days, waiting for the temperature to drop just another degree before it unleashed hell. Elias Thorne paused at the crest of a ridge, his breath pluming white in the thin air. He adjusted the strap of his pack, the weight of 3 marten pelts and a prime beaver skin pressing against his spine. He was a man built of rawhide and silence, standing 6 feet and 2 inches, with a beard that held the gray of wood ash and eyes the color of a frozen creek. Down in the valley, in the settlement of Granite Creek, they called him half-wild. They whispered that he had ridden with the glint of madness in his eyes during the war, that he had scouted for generals who burned the earth, and that he had left his soul somewhere on a battlefield in Virginia or a canyon in the territories. They were not entirely wrong. He checked the sky again. The clouds were descending, swallowing the granite spires one by one. He needed to get back to the cabin. The trapline could wait. The animals would hole up just as he intended to. He turned his skis, long, curved lengths of ashwood, and began the descent toward the timberline. It was then that the flash of color stopped him. It was unnatural against the monochrome palette of the mountain, a stark, violent red. Elias narrowed his eyes, shielding them against the stinging grit the wind kicked up. Down the slope, perhaps 300 yards into a ravine that shadowed the sun, lay the carcass of a wagon. It was smashed against a boulder the size of a church. The wood splintered and splayed like broken ribs. He did not move immediately. Experience had taught him that a wreck often attracted predators, both 4-legged and 2. He scanned the tree line, his hand drifting instinctively to the stock of the Sharps rifle slung over his shoulder. The ravens were already there, black shapes spiraling against the gray sky, their croaking calls carrying on the wind. That meant meat. He guided his mule, a steady beast named Moses, who had been waiting in the shelter of the pines, down the rocky switchback. As he drew closer, the story of the disaster wrote itself in the snow. The wagon had not merely slipped, the tracks slewed sideways, deep and frantic. There were gouges where horses had been whipped into a frenzy, and there were other tracks, shod hooves, 6 riders, circling and then departing to the south. This was no accident. This was an ambush. Elias dismounted and tied Moses to a scrub cedar. The air smelled of wet wood and iron. He approached the wreckage with his rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. A bloodied kerchief lay trampled in the slush. A woman's shawl, torn in half, fluttered from a jagged piece of siding. Barrels of flour and salt pork had been smashed open. The contents scattered, but the valuable items, tools, weapons, the horses themselves, were gone. He circled the site, looking for bodies. There were none, though the snow was stained pink near the driver's seat. Whoever had been driving was likely dead or taken. He expected to find nothing but ghosts and garbage. But then a raven dipped low, landing on a clump of bitterbrush near the edge of a sheer drop-off, pecking at something hidden in the shadows. Elias stepped forward, kicking a stone loose. The bird squawked and flapped away. Curled in the hollow of the earth, beneath the brush, was a shape wrapped in the tattered remains of a blue dress. It was a woman. She was small, her boots worn through at the toes. She lay motionless, her face turned into the dirt, half covered by snow that had drifted over her. Elias crouched, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He had seen death 1,000 times, but finding it here, in his sanctuary, felt like a violation. He reached out, his large hand gloved in rough buckskin, intending to check for a pulse at her neck or to turn her over for a proper look before he began the grim task of digging a grave in the frozen ground. His fingers brushed her shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The woman snapped awake with a scream that sounded like tearing metal. She did not look at him. She did not seem to see him. She thrashed backward, scrabbling in the dirt, her heels digging in as she tried to propel herself away from him. Her eyes were wide, blown black with a terror so absolute it looked like madness. "Don't touch me!" The words were ripped from a throat raw with cold. She flailed, one hand coming up to claw at the air between them. I can't bear another man's touch. Don't! Elias recoiled as if he had grabbed a hot coal. He scrambled backward, boots slipping on the ice, holding his hands up high where she could see them. Easy, he rumbled. His voice was rusty from disuse. Easy now. She was hyperventilating, ragged gasps that puffed white in the freezing air. She had backed herself right to the lip of the drop-off. One more foot, and she would tumble 200 feet into the creek bed below. I ain't touching you, Elias said, pitching his voice low and steady, the way he spoke to a spooked horse. Look at me. Look at my hands. I am 10 feet away. She pressed her back against a rock, knees drawn up to her chest. She was shivering so violently that her teeth clacked together audibly. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing skin that was marbled blue and purple with cold. Her hands were raw, bleeding from where she must have climbed or crawled. You're with them, she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a condemnation. I am with no one, Elias said. I am just a trapper. I found the wagon. She stared at him, her eyes darting from his face to his rifle and back to his hands. She looked like a creature caught in a steel jaw, waiting for the hammer to fall. Elias realized two things in quick succession. First, she had been hunted and hurt by men, likely the ones who left those tracks. Second, if he left her here, the storm would kill her within the hour. She was already in the grip of hypothermia. Her movements were jerky, her focus drifting. You can't stay here, he said plainly. Storm's coming. It will bury this ridge. Let it, she hissed, though her voice lacked power. Leave me be. I can't do that. You promised, she cried out, panic spiking again. You said you wouldn't touch me. I won't, Elias said. But I won't leave you to freeze either. He stood up slowly. She flinched, squeezing her eyes shut and turning her face away, anticipating a blow. The gesture twisted something deep in Elias's gut, an old, ugly anger at the cruelty of the world. He unbuttoned his heavy buffalo hide coat. The wind instantly cut through his flannel shirt and buckskin vest, biting at his skin. But he ignored it. He shrugged the coat off, holding it by the collar. I'm going to toss this to you, he announced. Catch it. Put it on. He threw the heavy garment. It landed in the snow a foot from her boots. She stared at it, then at him, suspicious. Go on, he urged. It is warm. She hesitated, her whole body trembling, slowly, watching him like a hawk. She reached out and dragged the coat toward her. It was immense on her, swallowing her small frame as she struggled to push her arms into the sleeves. The heat of his body still lingered in the fur, and he saw her shoulders drop an inch as the warmth hit her. Can you walk? He asked. She tried to stand, bracing herself against the rock. Her legs buckled immediately, numb and useless. She fell back with a sharp cry of frustration. Elias looked at the slope. It was steep and slick. He could carry her. It would be the easiest way, but he knew with absolute certainty that if he laid hands on her now, she might fight him until her heart gave out, or she might throw herself off the ledge to escape him. All right, he said. We do this a different way. He went to Moses and untied a length of hemp rope and a canvas tarp he used for hauling game. He found 2 sturdy planks from the wagon wreckage, shattered but long enough, with practiced knots. He lashed the planks and tarp together into a crude sled. He brought it to within 5 feet of her. Get on the tarp, he instructed. She looked at the sled, then at the steep climb up toward the trail where the mule waited. I can't. You can, Elias said. I will pull. You just hold on. I won't come closer than the end of this rope. That is 12 feet. Is that safe enough? She looked at the rope, measuring the distance. It was a lifeline, but it was also a tether. Finally, desperation won out. She crawled onto the canvas, wrapping his coat tighter around herself. Ready? He asked. She nodded, a jerk of her chin. Elias threw the rope over his shoulder and leaned into the hill. He dug his boots into the scree, thighs burning as he hauled her weight up the slope. He did not look back, sensing that his gaze might feel like a threat. He focused on the rhythm of his breathing and the placement of his feet. "The right side is rough," he called out over the wind. "Lean left." He heard the scrape of the planks shifting as she obeyed. "Root coming up, hold tight." They worked their way up the ravine, a slow, agonizing procession. By the time they reached the mule, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick, wet flakes that clung to eyelashes and beards. He secured the sled behind Moses. The mule flicked his ears back, unhappy with the storm, but held steady. Elias walked alongside the animal, keeping the distance he had promised. The journey to the cabin was a race against the whiteout. The temperature plummeted. The wind shrieked through the lodgepole pines, a sound like 1,000 grieving women. Elias glanced back every few minutes. The woman, he didn't even know her name, was huddled in a ball on the sled, his coat pulled over her head. She was shaking so hard the sled vibrated. He wanted to stop. He wanted to lift her onto the mule, or better yet, pull her against him, sharing his body heat, shielding her from the biting wind. It was what survival dictated. But every time he looked at her, he remembered the wild terror in her eyes. "Don't touch me." So he walked. He walked on the windward side of the sled to break the gale for her, his own body growing numb, his beard icing over. "Not far," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "Keep your eyes open. Don't sleep." She mumbled something. He stepped a little closer, straining to hear. "Gentlemen," she whispered, the word catching on a sob. He said, "Safe passage." Elias frowned. "Who?" "Lock the door," she said, her voice stronger for a moment, fueled by a feverish delirium. He laughed. They all laughed. "The ranch house. Don't let them in." "Nobody is here," Elias said firmly. "Just us and the mountain." "Blue china," she muttered, drifting again. "Broken on the floor." He stopped asking questions. The answers were shards of a nightmare he could piece together well enough. A man with money. A promise broken. A room where no meant nothing. It was an old story. One that made Elias grip the lead rope until his knuckles turned white. They reached the cabin at dusk. It was a low structure of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, tucked into the lee of a granite overhang that protected it from the worst of the avalanches. Smoke whipped from the stovepipe, a gray ribbon instantly torn apart by the gale. Elias halted the mule. He untied the sled. "We are here," he said. "Can you stand?" She pushed the coat back. Her face was gray, her eyes glassy. She tried to rise and failed. Elias stood 6 feet away, helpless. "Ma'am, you have to walk. I can't carry you unless you let me." She stared at the door of the cabin. It was dark wood, heavy, shut tight against the world. To him, it was safety. To her, it looked like another trap, another place with a lock. She gritted her teeth. With a groan that was half sob, she rolled off the sled and forced herself to her hands and knees. She crawled through the snow, grabbing the door frame and hauling herself upright. She swayed, clutching the rough wood. Elias moved quickly to the door, unlatched it, and pushed it inward. Warmth spilled out. Smelling of pine resin and old coffee, he stepped back, wide, into the snow, clearing the path. "It is yours," he said. "Go in." She hesitated, looking at him, waiting for the trick. When he didn't move, she stumbled across the threshold. Elias led the mule to the lean-to, stripped the tack with frozen fingers, and threw a blanket over the beast. He grabbed an armful of firewood and followed her inside. The cabin was small, just one room. A cast-iron stove sat in the center, radiating heat. A single bed built of pine poles stood in the corner, covered in furs. A rough table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with tins made up the rest. The woman was standing in the center of the room, dripping melting snow onto the floorboards. She was scanning the interior like a trapped wolf. Her eyes darted to the bed, then to the knife on the table, then to the pelts on the wall. Her shoulders were pulled up tight to her ears. Elias kicked the door shut against the wind, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. The sound made her jump and spin around, backing against the stove until the heat warned her away. "I am not going to hurt you," Elias said. He kept his voice low, stripping off his wet gloves. He did not move toward her. He moved to the far side of the room, putting the table between them. "You're a man," she said. The logic was simple and brutal in her mind. "I am," Elias acknowledged. "But I am the man who pulled you out of the snow, not the one who put you there." He saw her sway again. She was reaching the end of her endurance. "Here is how this works," Elias said, his tone practical and flat. "That bed is yours. I sleep on the floor. If you want me to sleep outside in the shed, say the word, though it is cold enough to freeze breath out there tonight." She looked at the bed, then at the floor. She didn't speak. "I won't touch you," he repeated. "But you are wet and you are freezing. You need dry clothes and hot water. I have a spare shirt. It will be a tent for you, but it is clean." He moved slowly to a chest at the foot of the bed, opening it to pull out a heavy flannel shirt and a pair of wool socks. He placed them on the bed. Then he went to the stove, took the kettle, and poured hot water into a basin. He set the basin on the chair next to the bed, along with a rag and a tin of salve. "For the cuts," he said, gesturing to the salve. He looked at her. She was still shivering, clutching his heavy coat around her like armor. "I'm going to turn around," Elias said. "I will face the wall. You get those wet things off and get into the bed. Tell me when you are covered." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back, facing the rough logs of the cabin wall. He crossed his arms over his chest, staring at a knot in the wood. Behind him, he heard the rustle of fabric, the wet slap of the heavy coat hitting the floor, the sound of a dress being unbuttoned with fumbling, frozen fingers, a sharp intake of breath, a stifled whimper of pain. Elias closed his eyes. The rage flared up in him again, hot and blinding. He imagined the men who had done this. He knew the type. Men who bought courage with whiskey and felt big only when they made someone else small. He had killed men for less during the war. The desire to saddle Moses and ride back down that mountain. Storm be damned. To hunt them down was a physical ache in his chest, but he couldn't. He had a bird with a broken wing in his cabin, and leaving her would be a death sentence. I am in," a small voice said. Elias turned. She was buried under the pile of furs on his bed. Only her face showed, pale as parchment against the dark bear hide. Her eyes were still wide, watching him. He walked to the stove, poured a tin cup of coffee, and set it on the table. "Drink," he said. "It will help the shaking." He took his own blanket from a hook on the wall and spread it on the floorboards on the far side of the room, near the door. He sat down and began to unlace his boots. The storm had fully descended now. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, shaking the sturdy logs. Snow hissed against the single pane of glass. The world outside was gone, reduced to white noise and violence. Inside, the fire crackled. Elias lay down, wrapping the blanket around himself. He stared up at the rafters, where dried herbs and smoked meat hung in the shadows. He listened to the room. He could hear her breathing. It was ragged, hitched with silent sobs. Every time the cabin creaked in the wind, her breath stopped, holding for a terrifying second before resuming. She was awake, terrified, waiting for him to move, waiting for the promise to be broken. He knew what she was seeing in the dark. He knew because he had his own ghosts. He saw the faces of boys he had led into ambushes. He saw the smoke of burning villages. He knew that the night was when the demons came out to feed. He turned his head slightly, looking toward the bed. He couldn't see her in the gloom, just the mound of furs. "You are safe here," he whispered. His voice was rough, barely audible over the wind. "I know you don't believe it yet, but you are." There was no answer, just a hitch in her breathing. "I meant what I said," Elias continued, speaking to the rafters now. "I have lived alone for a long time. I know how to keep to my own side of the line." He paused, listening to the storm rage against the walls, trying to batter its way in. "I'll wait," he said, the words falling into the darkness between them. "I'll wait till you're ready, if you ever are." He closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. He lay there, a sentinel on the hard wood floor. keeping watch over a stranger who feared his hands, while the snow buried them both in the silence of the high country. The morning did not break so much as it leaked gray light into the valley, filtering through a sky that had turned into a slab of pale iron. When Elias finally unbarred the heavy door to check the world outside, he found the landscape erased. The blizzard had buried the high country under 4 feet of fresh powder, drifting halfway up the cabin walls on the windward side. The pines, usually proud sentinels of green and black, were now bent double. Their branches groaned under the crushing white weight. He stood in the doorway, the cold air hitting his face like a physical blow, and looked toward the pass. It was gone. The cut in the mountains that led down to the valley and the town beyond was choked with snow, likely 10 feet deep in the narrows. They were not just isolated, they were entombed. Inside the cabin, a sudden, sharp cry cut through the quiet crackle of the stove. Elias spun around, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt before his mind caught up with where he was. Lena was thrashing in the bed, tangled in the buffalo robes, her head thrashing from side to side on the ticking pillow. She was crying out, jagged, unintelligible pleas that spoke of doors that wouldn't open and hands that wouldn't let go. His first instinct was to rush to her, to shake her awake as he would a comrade in the trenches having a night terror. He took 2 long strides across the plank floor before he stopped dead. He remembered the terror in her eyes the day before, the way she had scrambled toward the cliff edge to get away from him. If he touched her now, in the confusion of sleep, she might shatter completely. He stood in the center of the room, feeling helpless and overly large, his hands hanging useless at his sides. "Ma'am," he said, pitching his voice low. "Wake up! You are safe!" she gasped, her eyes snapping open, blind with panic. She scrambled backward until her spine hit the rough log wall at the head of the bed, pulling her knees up, her breath coming in shallow, frantic wheezes. She looked at him, a dark silhouette against the gray morning light, and he saw the recognition of threat before the recognition of safety. Elias did not move. He kept his distance, standing near the cast-iron stove. "It was a dream," he said simply. "Just a dream." She stared at him, her chest heaving, her hands gripping the fur blanket until her knuckles were white. The silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward. Elias felt the weight of the snow outside pressing against the walls. "I can get you water," he said, offering the choices slowly, like he was trading goods. "Or coffee, or I can be quiet. You choose." The offer seemed to confuse her. She blinked, her gaze darting around the small room, the pelts on the wall, the rifle in the corner, the steam rising from the kettle. She looked back at him, waiting for a command that did not come. "Coffee?" she whispered, the word barely more than a breath. Elias nodded once. He turned his back to her, a deliberate gesture, and busied himself with the pot. He poured the dark, strong brew into a tin cup, adding a drop of cold water to settle the grounds. When he turned back, he did not approach the bed directly. He walked to the rough-hewn table that sat between the stove and the sleeping area and set the cup down on the edge nearest to her. "There," he said. Then he retreated to the far side of the room, sitting on a stool to mend a trap chain, giving her the space to move. She watched him for a long time before she slowly uncoiled her legs. She reached out, her hand trembling, and took the cup. She drank with 2 hands, the steam hiding her face. It was the first truce of the winter. The days that followed blurred into a single, whitewashed stretch of time. The sun was a rumor, appearing only as a faint brightness behind the cloud cover before vanishing again. The cold was a living thing, a presence that sought out every chink in the mud caulking between the logs. At night, the temperature dropped low enough to snap tree limbs, sounding like rifle shots in the dark. Lena was ill for the first week. The exposure on the mountain had settled deep in her chest, and she burned with a fever that made her eyes bright and glassy. Elias tended to her with the care of a man handling black powder. He cooked thin broths from dried venison and snowmelt, leaving the bowl on the chair beside her bed. When she was too weak to sit up, he stacked pillows behind her back, but he never lifted her. He let her struggle to inch herself upright, watching with his hands clenched at his sides, intervening only with words. "Grab the post," he would say gently. "Pull with your left, there." Checking her fever presented a problem. He needed to know if the heat was breaking, but he could not lay his hand on her forehead. One evening, as she lay flushed and shivering, he pulled the stool close to the bed. "I need to check the heat," he told her. "I won't touch you. I am going to put my wrist near your head, just near—" She stiffened, her eyes fixing on his arm. She gave a small, jerky nod. Elias rolled back the sleeve of his flannel shirt. He extended his arm, bringing the inside of his wrist, where the skin was pale and sensitive, within an inch of her forehead. He held it there, hovering. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a dry, angry warmth that leaped across the gap between them. It was an intimate act, this measuring of distance, breathless and strange. "You are burning still," he murmured, withdrawing his arm slowly, "but not as bad as yesterday." She let out a breath she had been holding. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she had thanked him. As her strength returned, the confinement of the cabin began to chafe. She was a woman used to working, and idleness gave her too much time to wander down dark roads. She began to watch him as he moved through his chores, her eyes following the economy of his movements. One morning, while he was greasing his boots by the fire, she spoke up. "I can do the stew." Elias looked up. "You are still weak." "I am not crippled," she said, a flash of spirit entering her voice. "I can stir a pot." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right." He showed her the routine, keeping his distance. He taught her how to bank the stove for the night so the embers wouldn't die, explaining the draft controls from across the room. He showed her how to fold the heavy blankets so they trapped the most heat. These small tasks became her anchor. Folding a blanket was something she could control. Stirring the soup was a way to be useful, to pay for her keep in a currency other than fear. The cabin, once a prison, began to feel like a fortress they were holding together. But the winter was relentless. The wind never seemed to stop. Sometimes, in the dead of night, they would hear the wolves singing down in the valley, a lonely, hungry sound that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. Other times, the deep bass rumble of an avalanche would shake the ground beneath the floorboards, a reminder that the mountain could crush them without malice. Every trip to the woodshed was an expedition. Elias would tie a rope around his waist, the other end secured to the doorframe, before stepping out into the blinding whiteout to fetch fuel. He would come back in looking like a snowman, ice caked in his beard, stomping his boots while Lena watched from the safety of the table. 2 weeks in, a rare clear day broke over the range. The sky was a brilliant, hard blue, the sun dazzling on the snowfields. Lena stood by the window, pressing her hand against the cold glass. "I want to go out," she said. Elias looked up from the trap trigger he was whittling. "It is 10 degrees below freezing out there. Lena." He used her name now, though it still felt strange on his tongue. "I need air," she said. "I feel like I'm suffocating." He saw the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers tapped a frantic rhythm on the sill. He knew that look. It was the look of a soldier who had been in a dugout too long. "Put on the coat," he said, "and the scarf. Wrap it twice." She dressed with shaking hands, layering herself in the oversized wool and fur. When she opened the door, the cold hit her so hard she gasped, the air burning her lungs like smoke. She stepped out onto the small, cleared patch of ground in front of the cabin. The world was immense. The ridgeline stretched out forever, sharp white teeth biting into the blue sky. There was no smoke from other chimneys, no road, no sound but the wind hissing through the pines. Elias stood in the doorway, watching her. He expected her to be frightened by the vast emptiness. Instead, he saw her shoulders drop. She took a deep, stinging breath, filling her chest. "No one is here," she said, her voice carried away by the breeze. "No one but us," Elias confirmed. She turned to look at the horizon, squinting against the glare. "He can't get up here, not now. No man can get up here now. Elias said. Even the devil would freeze before he made the pass. She wrapped her arms around herself, not just for warmth, but as if holding herself together. It is clean, she said. Cold and clean. She stayed out until her lips turned blue, staring at the stone and snow as if memorizing the fact that she was free. That evening, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was less like a wall and more like a space that could be filled. They sat at the table, the oil lamp casting long shadows. Elias was oiling his rifle, the rhythmic snick-snick of the rag the only sound. Lena was mending a tear in his spare shirt, her needle flashing in the firelight. I was a seamstress, she said suddenly. She didn't look up from her work. Back east, in Ohio. My husband died of lung fever 3 years ago. Elias stopped his hand. He didn't look at her, sensing that eye contact might stop the flow of words. That is honest work, he said quietly. It was hard work, she corrected. But it was mine. Then the letters came from Mr. Baird. At the time, Elias felt a muscle in his jaw jump. He carefully set the rifle bolt down on the cloth. He wanted a wife, Lena continued, her voice flat, reciting the facts as if reading a ledger. He wrote beautiful letters. He spoke of a big house of security. He said he needed a partner, not a servant. He sent money for the passage. She paused, the needle hovering over the fabric. I was tired of being cold, she whispered. I was tired of counting pennies, so I came. He lied, Elias said. It wasn't a question. The house was big, she said, but it was empty, and miles from the nearest neighbor. He was not the man in the letters. He was angry, always angry. If supper was late, if I smiled the wrong way, he said he owned me. He said he paid for me, like he paid for a heifer. She took a breath that hitched in her throat. I tried to leave. I packed a bag. He caught me at the gate. She stopped. Her hands were trembling so hard she had to put the sewing down. She stared at the grain of the wood on the table. He dragged me back, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that Elias had to strain to hear. He locked me in the room upstairs. He took the key. I screamed for hours. I begged him. He just laughed. He said he would teach me what a wife is for. She didn't say the rest. She didn't have to. The words hung in the air, thick and choking, broken, filthy, ruined. Elias felt a rage so pure and white-hot that his vision blurred. His hands, hidden beneath the table, clenched into fists so tight his fingernails cut into his palms. He wanted to roar. He wanted to find this Baird and tear him apart with his bare hands, to make him feel every ounce of terror he had inflicted on this woman. But he kept his face still. He forced his hands to relax, one finger at a time. If he showed his anger now, she would see it as violence. She would think it was directed at her, or that her shame was reflecting on him. He is a dog, Elias said, his voice grinding like stones rubbing together. And he deserves a dog's death. Lena looked up, surprised by the venom in his tone. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself back. I shouldn't have believed him, she said, the shame creeping in. No, Elias said sharply. He looked her in the eye for the first time. You listen to me. A wolf doesn't ask the lamb for permission. You did nothing but trust a man who gave his word. The sin is his, all of it. She held his gaze for a long moment, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. Then she nodded, a small, fragile motion. And you, she asked, deflecting the attention. You live up here alone. They say in town you are half wild. Elias looked back at his rifle. He picked up the rag again, wiping a spot of non-existent grease. I rode for the army, he said. Scout, during the campaigns against the tribes. And before that, in the war. He paused, the memories rising up like bile. They call me half wild because I don't much like people anymore, he admitted. I saw things. I did things. He looked at his hands, large, scarred, capable of great violence. We burned a village once, he said, his voice hollow. Winter, just like this. Orders were to leave no shelter. There were women, children. We burned it all. I stood there and watched the smoke go up, and I felt nothing. That is what scares me. I didn't feel sad. I just felt cold, like a beast. He looked at her. I came up here to get away from the man I was down there. The confession hung between them. Two broken things, recognizing the cracks in each other. She had been a victim of violence. He had been a perpetrator of it. Both of them felt stained. Both of them felt they didn't belong in the light of decent society. "You saved me," Lena said softly. "A beast wouldn't have done that." Elias shrugged, uncomfortable with the absolution. "Maybe I am just trying to balance the ledger." The intimacy of the conversation lingered for days. They moved around each other with a new awareness. They were no longer strangers trapped together. They were comrades in a foxhole. Then came the afternoon with the kettle. Lena was moving the heavy cast-iron kettle from the stove to the table. She was stronger now, but the handle was slick with grease. As she turned, her grip slipped, the kettle tilted, boiling water sloshing over the rim. "Oh!" she cried out, dropping it. The kettle hit the floor with a clang, splashing hot water across her boots and the hem of her dress. Steam billowed up. Without thinking, she reached down instinctively to grab the handle, her hand going straight into the rising scald. Elias moved faster than thought. It was pure reflex, the honed instinct of a man who had survived by moving before he judged. He lunged across the gap between them and caught her wrist in midair, jerking her hand back from the steam. His grip was firm, his fingers wrapping completely around her slender wrist. For a heartbeat. Time stopped. Lena went rigid. Her breath hitched and locked in her throat. She stared down at his hand on her skin, the dark, weathered back of his hand against her pale forearm. The contact was electric, a shock that went straight to her marrow. Her muscles locked, waiting for the pain, waiting for the twist, the pull, the violence. Elias froze. He felt the frantic pulse beating under his thumb. He felt the delicacy of her bones. He realized what he had done. He released her instantly, snatching his hand back as if he had been burned. He took 2 large steps backward, putting the table between them. His hands held up, palms open. I am sorry," he stammered, his voice rough. "You were going to burn yourself. I didn't think so." Lena stood rooted to the spot, cradling her wrist against her chest. She was breathing hard, her eyes wide, but she wasn't screaming. She wasn't scrambling for the door. She looked at her wrist. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his fingers. It didn't hurt. He hadn't squeezed. He had held her just tight enough to save her. And then he had let go. It's all right," she said, her voice shaking. "You stopped me." "I shouldn't have grabbed you," Elias said, looking miserable. "I promised. You stopped the burn," she repeated. She looked at him, really looked at him. He was terrified that he had ruined all the progress they had made. He looked like a boy who had broken something precious. "It was different," she murmured, almost to herself. "What?" "Your hand," she said. "It didn't feel heavy." She turned away then, grabbing a rag to mop up the water, hiding her confusion. Later that night, after the lamp was out, she lay in the dark and touched her own wrist, wrapping her fingers around the spot where he had held her. She tried to summon the old fear, the memory of Baird's crushing grip, but all she could remember was the warmth of Elias's hand and the way he had let go the moment she was safe. It was a small crack in the dam, but the water was starting to seep through. The winter had one last test for them before the thaw. A storm hit in February, a true nor'easter that battered the cabin with winds that sounded like screaming banshees. The logs groaned under the assault, and the wind whistled down the stovepipe, filling the room with bursts of ash. Lena had been jumpy all day, the howling wind rasping against her nerves. When night fell, the noise became unbearable. It sounded like men shouting, like wood splintering, the sounds of the wagon wreck, the sounds of the locked room. She ended up on the floor in the corner, her hands pressed over her ears, rocking back and forth, eyes squeezed shut. "Make it stop," she sobbed. "Make them stop screaming." Elias sat on his blanket by the door. He couldn't stop the wind. He couldn't touch her to comfort her. The room was too small to get far enough away to make her feel truly safe. So he used the only thing he had left. "Lena," he said. His voice was a deep rumble, cutting under the shriek of the wind. "Listen to me. They're coming," she whimpered. "No one is coming," Elias said steadily. "Listen to the fire. Hear that pop? That is a pine knot. It burns hot." He kept talking. He didn't talk about the storm. He talked about the cabin. "I cut these logs myself," he said, his voice a rhythmic chant. "Felled them up on the ridge, hauled them down with Moses, notched them with a broadaxe. They are tight, they are strong. Nothing gets in here. Not the wind, not the wolves, not the men." She stopped rocking, just a little. She focused on the timbre of his voice. It was low and gravelly, a sound of the earth. "Tell me more," she whispered. "I built the chimney from river stones," he went on. "Hauled them up from the creek bottom, one by one, selected them for their flat sides. Mixed the mortar with lime and sand. It has stood for 10 years. It will stand for 10 more. He told her about the river and the spring flood, how the water turned brown and wild. He told her about the elk herds moving across the high meadows in summer, silent as ghosts. He spun a web of words around her, a barrier against the storm. Slowly, her hands came down from her ears. Her breathing slowed to match the cadence of his story. She fell asleep there on the floor, curled on the rug, lulled by the man who kept watch. By the time March arrived, the dynamic in the cabin had shifted. The snow was still deep, but the light lasted longer in the evenings. Trust had grown in the silence, like moss on a stone. Lena no longer flinched when Elias walked past her. She could sit across the small table from him at meals, meeting his gray eyes without the urge to look for an exit. Sometimes, she would stand near the stove while he cooked, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, a solid, living warmth that she no longer found terrifying. She would catch him looking at her when he thought she wasn't noticing, a look of unguarded longing that he quickly hid behind a cough or a turn of his head. And she found herself looking back. She noticed the way his shirt stretched across his broad shoulders. She noticed the gentleness in his hands when he worked on his traps. The fear was still there, a deep scar tissue, but something else was growing underneath it. A curiosity, a flicker of desire that terrified and thrilled her. He had kept his promise. He had waited. And because he had waited, because he had demanded nothing, she found herself wondering, for the first time, what it might be like if she asked. The iron grip of winter did not release the mountain all at once. It let go by degrees, a slow and grudging surrender that changed the texture of the world outside the cabin walls, the silence of the deep freeze, where the air itself seemed suspended in crystal, gave way to the sound of water. It started as a rhythmic dripping from the eaves, a relentless ticking clock that marked the passage of noon. Then came the heavy, wet thuds of snow sliding off the pine boughs, freeing the branches to spring back toward the sky. The snowpack, once powdery and dry enough to swirl in the wind, settled into a dense, heavy crust that crunched loudly underfoot. Inside the cabin, the air shifted too. The desperate, huddled panic of survival began to flatten out into a routine that felt almost like peace. Lena moved through the small space with a new authority. In the first weeks, she had been a ghost, haunting the edges of the room, terrified of taking up space. Now, she claimed the territory. She took Elias's spare shirts, the ones with elbows blown out and seams unraveled, and sat by the window where the light was best. With a bone needle and thread scavenged from an old sewing kit Elias kept in a tin, she wove the fabric back together. Her stitches were tiny and precise, the work of a woman who had once made her living by the grace of her hands. She was mending him, piece by piece, though she would not have said it aloud. She learned the rhythm of the stove, coaxing more heat from less wood. She took the dried venison and beans that Elias prepared with soldierly indifference and added crushed juniper berries and wild onion from the dried bunches hanging in the rafters, turning fuel into food. The cabin, which had been a stark shelter of raw wood and necessity, began to look faintly like a home, A tin cup held spruce tips on the sill. The blankets were folded with sharp, military corners. Elias watched her. He sat in the evenings with his pipe unlit, observing the way she moved. She no longer flinched when he stood up to put a log on the fire. She no longer tracked his hands as if they were weapons. One morning, when the sky was a bruised purple clearing to blue, Elias took his snowshoes from the wall. "The crust is hard enough to walk on," he said. "You need to use your legs." Lena looked up from the beans she was sorting. The fear flickered in her eyes. The safety of the cabin was hard to leave. But she nodded. She wanted to see something other than four walls. They walked out into a world that was blindingly bright. Elias helped her strap on a pair of ash wood shoes, kneeling in the snow 3 feet away to demonstrate the bindings on his own boot before letting her mimic the knot. He did not touch her foot. "Keep your weight back," he instructed. "Lift the toe." They walked for an hour, cutting a path through the timberline. Elias stayed 6 paces ahead, breaking the trail, but he stopped often to let her catch her breath. He spoke little, but when he did, it was to give her the keys to the land. He pointed to a set of tracks that looked like post holes in the snow. "Elk," he said, "moving heavy, probably a cow with a calf slow behind her." He showed her how the clouds curled over the high peaks to the west. "Mare's tails," he said, pointing to the wispy streaks. "The wind is coming. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe tonight." Lena absorbed it all. It was a language she had never learned, a way of reading the world that had nothing to do with ledgers or social graces. It made her feel capable. A week later, they followed a line of deer tracks up a steep ridge that formed the spine of the valley. The climb was brutal, burning the muscles in Lena's thighs and filling her lungs with air so thin it felt like drinking cold water. When they reached the crest, the ground fell away in a sheer drop. The view stopped her breath. Before them lay the entire range, a sea of white waves frozen in stone. To the east, far below, the valley opened up. It was a patchwork of white and the dark gray of naked cottonwoods along the river bottom. And there, miles away, she saw a thin, gray thread of smoke rising from a homestead chimney. "That is the Miller place," Elias said, standing beside her but keeping his respectful distance. 10 miles as the crow flies, 20 by the trail." Lena stared at the smoke. It looked fragile, insignificant. Is that where the town is?" she asked, pointing further south. "The town is another 30 miles beyond that ridge," Elias said. "A 2-day ride in good weather." Lena felt a strange sensation unfurl in her chest. Down there, in the town, Baird was a giant. He was money and influence and fear. He filled the streets, he owned the sheriff, his voice could close doors. But from up here, looking down from the shoulder of the mountain, the world of men seemed ridiculous and small. Baird was nothing but a speck in a valley that didn't care if he lived or died. "He can't reach me here," she said. The wind snatched the words from her mouth, but she heard them. "No," Elias agreed, looking at her profile. "Up here, the only law is gravity." She stood straighter, pulling the cold air deep into her chest. For the first time in months, she felt powerful. She was not a victim hiding in a hole. She was standing on top of the world. The mountain, however, was a jealous host. It did not like to be taken for granted. 3 days later, on a venture to check a marten trap near the creek, the weather turned on them with the sudden violence of a spring squall. The sky, which had been clear at breakfast, curdled into a churning mass of white. The wind hit them like a physical blow, screaming down the canyon and picking up the loose surface snow to create a blinding whiteout. "We can't make the cabin," Elias shouted over the roar. "Visibility is 0. Lena couldn't see him, even though he was only yards away. She felt the panic rising, the white blindness disorienting her inner ear. She stumbled, falling to her knees. "Elias!" she screamed, the wind tearing the name away. A hand grabbed her shoulder, thick, heavy, anchoring. She didn't flinch this time. She leaned into it. Elias loomed out of the white haze. "This way!" he yelled. "Shelter!" He guided her, not dragging but pushing against the wind, shielding her with his body. They scrambled up a scree slope, blind and freezing, until the rock face loomed dark above them. Elias found the spot he knew, a shallow overhang where a slab of granite had sheared off the cliff, creating a cave barely 4 feet deep and 3 feet high. "In," he commanded. Lena crawled into space. It was dry, lined with old leaves and dust, but it was small, terrifyingly small. Elias followed her in, dragging his pack to block the opening against the wind. The space forced them together. The roof of the overhang was too low to sit up straight, and the back wall pushed them forward. To fit, they had to sit with their knees drawn up, shoulders hunched. The sudden cessation of the wind's assault left a ringing silence in the small space, broken only by their ragged breathing. Lena was shaking, from the cold, from the adrenaline, and from the sudden, overwhelming proximity of him. He was right there. She could smell him, the scent of wet buckskin, wood smoke, pine resin, and the sharp, iron tang of a man who worked hard. It wasn't a bad smell. It was raw and real. She pressed herself against the stone wall, trying to make herself small. Her shoulder brushed his arm, and she felt the heat of him through his coat. A wave of sensation crashed over her, confusing and terrifying. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with the flight response of a prey animal, but with something else, a fierce, hot rush of awareness. She saw the deep line of his throat where his scarf had loosened. She saw the rough stubble on his jaw, frosted with ice. She hated it. She hated that her body reacted. She hated that fear and desire were so twisted together in her gut that she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "I can't," she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. "I can't do this." Elias shifted, trying to give her an inch more space, but there was none to give. "The squall will pass," he said calmly. "Maybe an hour. We just have to wait." "I hate this," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and tears. "I hate my own skin. I hate that I am shaking. I hate that I am afraid of you and... She couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't say that I want to lean into you. Elias looked at her. The gray light filtering through the snow-blocked entrance caught the wetness on her cheeks. "Lena," he said softly, "there is nothing wrong with your body. It is doing what it knows to survive. It remembers pain. That is not a defect. That is a defense." "It betrays me," she sobbed. "It makes me weak." "No," he said firmly. "The men who broke your trust, they are the ones who are wrong. You are just healing. And healing hurts like hell. A broken bone hurts more when it knits than when it snaps." Outside, the temperature plummeted. The wind howled, driving the cold into their small sanctuary. Lena's shivering became violent. Her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. Elias watched her, his face grim. He knew the signs. Hypothermia didn't care about trauma. It just killed. "Lena," he said, his voice serious, "we have a problem. The air here is dropping. You are shaking too hard." She hugged her knees, unable to answer. "We have two choices," Elias said plainly. "We stay apart, and we risk the frost taking your toes or stopping your heart. Or we share heat." She froze, her eyes snapping to him. "I will not touch you unless you say it," he promised, his gaze steady on hers. "But if we don't combine warmth, this is going to be a bad hour." She looked at him. She saw the reluctance in his own face. He didn't want to frighten her. He was offering a survival tactic. Nothing more, but the thought of his arms around her, of being trapped in a hold, made bile rise in her throat. And yet, the cold was a knife in her marrow, and underneath the fear, that treacherous spark of hunger flared again. She wanted to be warm. She wanted to feel safe. "How?" she whispered. "I sit behind you," he said, describing it like a military maneuver. "Back to chest. You lean on me. I put my arms around your middle to hold the coat closed. That traps the heat." He paused. "You have the control. If you want to move away, you move. If you tell me to let go, I let go." Instantly, Lena stared at the stone floor. She weighed the ghosts of the past against the reality of the freezing present. She took a breath that shuddered in her lungs. "Okay," she breathed. "But if I say stop, then I stop," he swore. Elias moved slowly. He shifted his position, extending his legs, and nodded for her to move. She turned, backing toward him like a skittish horse. She sat down between his legs, her back to his chest. She felt the heat of him instantly, a solid wall of warmth. She stiffened, every muscle locking tight, waiting for the trap to spring. "I am going to put my arms around you now," he warned softly. He brought his arms around her waist. He did not pull her tight. He did not grope. He simply clasped his hands together over her stomach, his fingers laced loosely, resting there. The contact was shocking. It was almost unbearable. Her heart raced so fast she thought he must be able to feel it drumming against his own ribs. The smell of him filled her nose. His breath, warm and rhythmic, brushed past her ear. She held her breath, waiting for the panic to overwhelm her, but he didn't move. He was as still as the granite behind them. He was just there, solid, warm, protective, slowly, agonizingly. She let her breath out. She let her head tip back just an inch until it rested against his shoulder. The relief hit her like a physical weight. The tears spilled over, hot and fast. She started to cry, silently at first, and then with racking sobs that shook her whole body. Elias didn't hush her. He didn't tighten his grip to restrain her. He just held the space. He kept his hands still, his fingers open and gentle, proving to her, second by second, that he was not them. The moment hung suspended, thick with emotion. It wasn't erotic in the way the novels she used to read described. It was something far more intense. It was the intimacy of survival. It was the heat of one life sustaining another. But the heat was there, beneath the layers of wool and fear. She felt the hard plane of his chest. She felt the strength in his arms. And she knew, with a terrifying clarity, that she didn't want him to let go. The squall broke an hour later, leaving the world scoured and clean. They walked back to the cabin in silence, the snow crunching loudly in the quiet air. That night, the cabin felt different. The air was charged. The memory of his arms around her was a phantom sensation she couldn't shake. It lingered on her ribs, on her back. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The terror that usually accompanied the thought of a man's touch was absent, replaced by a strange, hollow ache. It was hunger, not just for warmth, but for that specific tenderness she had felt in the cave. She had never known a man could be strong without being cruel. She had never known a man could hold her without taking from her. Elias sat at the table, whittling a piece of pine. He seemed focused on the wood, but she noticed his hand paused often. He was aware of her. Lena sat up. She walked to the table and poured herself a cup of water. Instead of retreating to her side of the room, she sat down on the bench beside him. She sat closer than she ever had before, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the radiant heat of his arm. Elias went still. The knife stopped moving on the wood. He didn't look at her, but his posture was rigid, like a man holding his breath. They sat in silence for a long time, the fire popping in the stove, then moving with a slow, deliberate courage. Lena shifted her weight. She let her arm relax until her sleeve brushed against his. The contact was slight, just wool against flannel, but it sent a jolt through the room that was louder than a gunshot. Elias's hand, the one holding his coffee cup, tightened. His knuckles turned white. He gripped the tin so hard the metal creaked. He was fighting the instinct to reach for her, fighting the hunger that had been gnawing at him all winter. Lena saw his hand. She saw the restraint. And for the first time in her life, she felt a spark of pride. She was not the victim here. She was the one reaching out. She was the one choosing this. "Elias," she said. Her voice was steady. He turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes were dark, unguarded for just a second, full of a want so deep it frightened her. "You didn't pull away," she said. "I promised I wouldn't touch you." He rasped. I didn't promise I didn't want to. The honesty of it took her breath away. I don't know what I want, she admitted, looking down at her hands. I don't know if I want that, or if I am just so desperate to feel something good that I am confusing it with safety. It is a hard road to tell the difference, Elias said. Does it make you angry? She asked. That I am broken? You ain't broken. Lena, you are hurt. There is a difference. He set the knife down. And I am not angry at you. I am angry that I have to keep my hands to myself when you are sitting right there. But I will keep doing it. Why? Because when you come to me, Elias said, his voice low and rough, if you ever do, it has to be because you are running toward me, not running away from something else. Lena felt a tear slide down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly. I think I am done running. Don't rush the season, Elias said gently. The snow is still deep, but the snow was melting. In the weeks that followed, the thaw began in earnest. The creek swelled to a roar, brown with mud and runoff. The road down the pass began to emerge from the drifts, a black scar in the white landscape. Lena watched the road with a growing dread. Winter had been a prison. Yes, but it had been a sanctuary. The snow had been a wall that kept the world out. Now, the wall was falling. She found herself standing by the window, watching the trail, flinching at the movement of shadows. She knew what lay at the bottom of the mountain, the town, the rumors, and Baird. He was a man who viewed possession as 9/10 of the law, and she was a possession that had stolen itself. She feared he had not forgotten. She feared that while she and Elias had been building this fragile, quiet world in the clouds, Baird had been down in the valley, nursing his grudge, waiting for the road to clear. One evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the peaks, a sound echoed up the valley. It was a sharp, flat crack. It rolled over the mountains, bouncing off the granite walls. It was unmistakable. Lena dropped the spoon she was holding. It clattered loudly on the floor. Elias was at the door in a second, his rifle in his hand. He cracked the door open, stepping out onto the porch, listening. The air was still. What was it? Lena whispered from the shadows of the room. Elias stood motionless, his head cocked, analyzing the echo. Rifle, he said grimly. High caliber. Buffalo gun or a Sharps. Hunters? She asked, hoping to make her voice thin. Elias looked down toward the valley floor, where the shadows were gathering like pools of ink. The pass was barely open, the mud still axle deep. Hunters didn't push that hard just for a deer. Maybe, he lied, but his brow was furrowed, and his thumb brushed the hammer of his weapon. He stepped back inside and barred the door, sliding the heavy timber into place with a thud that sounded final. He looked at Lena. The peace of the winter was gone. The world was creeping closer, and it was coming with gunpowder and lead. We need to be ready, he said. The quiet is over. Spring arrived in the high country, not with the gentle unfurling of green leaves, but with the roar of violence. The thaw broke the spine of the winter silence, sending millions of gallons of meltwater crashing down the granite chutes. The creeks, which had been silent ribbons of ice for 5 months, were now brown, frothing monsters that chewed at the banks and carried whole trees down toward the valley. Elias stood on the porch of the cabin, listening to the dull thunder of the river 3 miles below. The air smelled of wet earth, pine resin, and the peculiar, sweet scent of rotting snow. We are out of flour, he said, not looking back at the room. Coffee is gone. The salt pork is down to the rind. Lena was wiping down the table. She paused, the rag still in her hand. She knew what this meant. The isolation that had been her shield was dissolving along with the snowpack. Is the pass open? She asked, her voice tight. Muddy, Elias said, turning to face her. Treacherous, but passable for a mule if we take it slow. He leaned against the door frame, his large frame filling the light. I need to go down. Lena, we can't eat pine needles. And I need to know what the wind is saying down there. If men are looking, I need to know their names. Lena wrung the rag out, her knuckles white. The town, Granite Creek, to Elias. It was a place of commerce and annoyance. To her, it was a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Down there were laws. There were sheriffs who drank with cattlemen. There was talk. And there was the terrifying possibility that Baird had not just gone away, but was waiting like a spider at the center of a web. "I can stay here," she said, though the thought of the empty cabin, with the door unbarred and Elias gone for 3 days, made her stomach turn over. "You could," Elias agreed slowly. "But if they are looking, and they track me back, or if someone followed the wagon tracks before the snow fell, I won't be here to stop them." He let the silence hang between them. He wasn't trying to frighten her. He was paying her the compliment of the truth. "And," he added, his voice softer, "you can't hide in a hole forever. A hole is just a grave with both ends open." They spent the evening debating it by the fire. Lena paced the small floor, arguing with her own terror. If she went down, she risked exposure. If Baird accused her of theft, for the horse she took, or the clothes on her back, the law would look at her, a woman with no husband and no money, and see a criminal. But if she stayed, she remained a prisoner of her own fear, dependent on Elias for every scrap of bread, lurking in the shadows while life happened elsewhere. "I will go," she said finally, staring into the embers. "But on my terms." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Which are?" "I don't use my name. Not the one Baird knows. And I don't speak of him. Not yet. I want to see the shape of the wolf before I step into the trap." "Agreed," Elias said. "We go at first light." The journey down the mountain was a brutal reintroduction to the world. The trail, which Elias knew by heart, had been erased in places by mudslides. Where there had once been solid earth, there was now slick, gray clay that sucked at the mule's hooves. They moved slowly. Elias walked ahead, leading Moses, testing every foot of the track with a long ash pole. Lena followed, her skirts hemmed up and pinned, wearing a pair of Elias's old boots stuffed with wool to fit her feet. At the crossing of Cutthroat Creek, the bridge was gone, swept away by the floodwaters. The only way across was a fallen lodgepole pine that spanned the churning white water, slick with spray. Lena stared at the rushing water. It was deafening, a chaotic force that seemed to pull at her balance just by looking at it. "I can't," she shouted over the roar. Elias tied the mule to a sapling and walked back to her. He didn't offer his hand. He knew better. He stood close enough to be heard, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "Don't look at the water," he commanded. "Look at the wood. Look at my boots." He stepped onto the log. "Step where I step. Listen to my voice. I won't let you fall. Lena, but you have to move." She forced her eyes away from the foam and fixed them on the back of his coat. She stepped out. The log vibrated under her weight. The spray soaked her hem. Every instinct screamed at her to crouch, to freeze. "Left foot!" Elias's voice came back to her, steady as a rock. "There is a knot. Step over it. Good. Keep coming. Eyes on me." His voice became a lifeline, a rope of sound that pulled her across the abyss. When her boots hit the mud on the far bank, her knees gave out, and she sat down hard in the wet grass. Shaking, Elias stood over her. He didn't help her up, but he shielded her from the wind while she found her breath. "You did it," he said. "The hardest part is behind us." It wasn't. The weather turned on them in the afternoon. A cold, driving rain swept in from the west, turning the air to ice. It soaked through their coats, plastering Lena's hair to her skull. The mule, skittish from the storm, nearly slipped on a shale slope, sliding 10 feet before Elias managed to haul its head up and stop the slide. By nightfall, they were exhausted, wet to the bone, and miles from the tree line. They found shelter under a sandstone ledge that offered protection from the rain, but little warmth. Elias unpacked the bedroll. The canvas tarp was dry, but the damp had seeped into the pack. One blanket was soaked through. Only one was dry. He looked at it, then at Lena, who was shivering so violently her teeth were clicking together. "We share it," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias hesitated. "Lena, I am not going to freeze to death for the sake of propriety. Elias, she snapped, her voice brittle with cold. And neither are you. He nodded once. He laid the dry blanket over a bed of pine boughs he had cut. They lay down fully clothed, side by side, pulling the wool and the canvas tarp over them. The space under the ledge was tight. They lay on their backs, staring up at the stone roof inches above their faces. Their shoulders were pressed together. Their hips bumped when they shifted. The heat from his body was a furnace, seeping into her frozen side. For a long time, neither spoke. The rain hissed beyond the overhang. I miss it, Lena whispered into the dark. Elias turned his head slightly. Miss what? Touching, she said. The word hung in the air, fragile and heavy. I miss a hand held without fear. I miss being held by someone who doesn't want to take something from me. I miss a kiss that isn't a demand. Her voice broke, a jagged sound in the small space. I lie here, and I can feel you next to me, and part of me wants to curl into you so bad it hurts, and the other part is waiting for you to hurt me. I have never known desire without dread. Elias, I don't know if I can ever separate them. Elias lay still. He was fighting his own battle. The urge to wrap his arm around her was a physical ache in his chest, but he kept his hands folded on his own chest. They don't have to be kin, he said softly. Desire and dread, men like Baird, they twist them together until you can't tell the ends apart. But that is a lie they tell with their hands. He turned his head further, so his breath brushed her cheek. He didn't move closer, but the intimacy of his voice was a caress in itself. You are not ruined, Lena, he said. The capacity to want, that is the part of you that is still alive. It is the part he couldn't kill. Don't hate it. She closed her eyes, tears leaking out to wet her temples. She didn't move away. She stayed pressed against his side, absorbing his heat and his words, letting the steady rhythm of his breathing lull her into a fitful sleep. The next day, the trail widened as it dropped into the foothills. The mud began to dry into ruts. They were nearing civilization. Around noon, they heard the jingle of unparalleled bits and the heavy tread of horses. A group of 4 riders came around the bend. Cowboys, by the look of them, drifting between ranches for spring work. They were rough men, smelling of wet wool and tobacco, with eyes that were too sharp. They pulled up as they saw Elias and the mule. Their gazes, however, went instantly to Lena. She was walking with her head down, her bonnet pulled low, but she felt their eyes like physical touches. Well now, the lead rider said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. Look at this. Old Man Thorne came down from the clouds, and he found himself a stray. The other men laughed. A low, ugly sound. Didn't know you had it in you, Thorne! Another man jeered. She looks a little used up, doesn't she? Found her in a drift? Elias didn't stop walking. He kept one hand on the mule's lead rope, the other resting casually near the knife at his belt. His face was a mask of stone. The road is wide enough for all, Elias said, his voice flat. Keep riding. The lead rider turned his horse, blocking the path. He looked Lena up and down, his eyes stripping away the layers of wool. There is a man named Baird looking for a runaway, the rider said, his tone conversational but with an edge. Big cattleman, offering $50 for news of a girl, said she was flighty, said she stole from him. Lena stopped. The blood drained from her face. She gripped the side of the mule's pack, her knuckles white. $50. That was more money than these men would see in 3 months. Elias stopped too. He looked the rider in the eye. The silence stretched, thin and dangerous. I don't know any Baird, Elias said, and I don't know any girls. This is my wife. The lie rolled off his tongue with the weight of iron. The rider narrowed his eyes. He looked at Elias, the size of him, the scars, the reputation that hung around him like smoke. Then he looked at the $50 in his imagination. He decided the money wasn't worth the blood. Just asking, friend, the rider sneered. He kicked his horse. Come on, boys. Smells like a wet dog out here anyway. They rode past, crowding Lena toward the edge of the trail. One of them made a kissing noise as he passed. when they were gone. Lena stood trembling in the mud. "He is looking," she whispered. "He put a price on me." "We knew he would," Elias said. He didn't touch her, though he stood between her and the retreating riders. "Now we know the price. $50. It is cheap for a living." "It is enough to make every drifter a hunter," she said. "Then we move carefully." Elias said, "Come on, the town is ahead." Granite Creek was a collection of gray, weathered buildings clinging to the banks of the river. It was a place of false fronts and muddy streets, where the church steeple and the saloon sign competed for height. To Lena, after months of the clean white silence of the peaks, it felt crowded, loud, and hostile. They walked down the main street. Heads turned. Curtains twitched. Elias was a known quantity. The mountain man, the hermit, the savage. But to see him with a woman, that was news. Lena walked with her head high, forcing herself not to shrink, but she felt the judgment. It was in the eyes of the women sweeping their porches, who paused to whisper behind their hands. It was in the leering grins of the men loitering outside the livery. To them, she was a curiosity. A woman who came out of the woods with a man like Thorne could only be one thing. They went to the general store first. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound that felt mocking. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and dust. Mrs. Gable, the wife of the banker, was at the counter. She turned as they entered, her silk skirts rustling. Her eyes widened as they landed on Lena, on the mended dress, the men's boots, the sun-darkened skin. She leaned toward the storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, and whispered loudly enough to cut glass. Some girls lose their shame along with their shoes. It seems, running off with a savage. They deserve what they get. Lena flushed, the heat climbing up her neck. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shout that she hadn't run for love. She had run for her life. She wanted to show them the bruises that had faded but were still etched into her memory. But her voice died in her throat. Elias walked to the counter. He placed a stack of furs on the wood. Beaver, marten, fox. "Supplies," he said. "Flour, coffee, sugar, and a room for the lady at the boarding house." Mr. Henderson looked at the furs, then at Mrs. Gable, then at Lena. He sneered. "I'll take the furs," Henderson said. "But I ain't selling to her, and I ain't facilitating your arrangements. We have decent people here." Elias went very still. The air in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Her money is green," Elias said softly. "And these furs are prime. You will sell her what she needs." "I reserve the right to refuse service to tramps," Henderson said, puffed up by the presence of his respectable customer. Elias reached across the counter. He didn't strike the man. He simply grabbed the front of Henderson's shirt and pulled. The storekeeper came over the counter halfway, his feet dangling, his face inches from Elias's. "You will apologize," Elias said, his voice a low rumble, "and then you will sell her the flour." "Elias!" Lena cried out, stepping forward. "Don't!" The door banged open. "Here now!" Sheriff Grady stood in the doorway, his hand on his gun. He was a weary-looking man with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble. "Put him down. Thorne," the sheriff said. "I won't have brawling in the mercantile." Elias held Henderson for a second longer, his eyes boring into the man, then shoved him back. Henderson stumbled, knocking over a jar of peppermint sticks. "He refused a lawful trade," Elias said, "and you are disturbing the peace." Grady said. He looked at Lena. His eyes were not unkind, but they were guarded. "You folks buy your goods and move along. And Thorne, keep your temper on the mountain." They bought the supplies in a tense silence, Henderson weighing the flour with shaking hands. When they walked back out onto the street, Lena felt stripped raw. They tried the boarding house next. The sign said, "Vacancy." The owner, a stern woman with hair pulled back so tight it pulled her eyes wide, blocked the doorway. "One room," Elias said. "For her, I will sleep in the stable or by the river." The woman looked Lena up and down, seeing the mud on her hem and the way she stood close to Elias. "I run a respectable house." She sniffed. I don't rent to women with no account. And I certainly don't rent to mistresses who pretend to sleep alone. Take your business to the saloon, where it belongs." She slammed the door. Lena stood on the porch, staring at the peeling paint of the door. The insult felt like a slap. Mistress, whore, tramp. The words were stones, thrown by people who didn't know her name. "Lena," Elias said gently. She turned to him. Her eyes were dry, burning with humiliation. "I won't stay here," she said. "I won't give them my money to sleep in a bed where they think I am dirt." "We can camp," Elias said. "There is a stand of cottonwood south of town, by the river. It is quiet there." "Let's go," she said. They set up camp as the sun went down. It was a poor substitute for a room. A small fire. The canvas tarp strung between two trees. The damp ground. But it was away from the staring eyes. They ate beans and hardtack in silence. The coyotes began to yip in the distance, a sound that usually frightened Lena, but tonight felt like a welcome chorus compared to the whispers of the town. Lena put her plate down. She wrapped her arms around her knees, staring into the fire. "Are you ashamed?" she asked quietly. Elias looked up from his coffee. "What?" "To be seen with me," she said. "They look at me like I am something stuck to your boot. They think I am your woman," in the low way. "Does it shame you?" Elias set his cup down on a rock. He moved around the fire until he was sitting across from her, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "I am ashamed," he said, his voice heavy. "I am ashamed of them. I am ashamed that people who call themselves Christians would turn away a woman in need because of pride." He leaned forward. "Lena, look at me." She raised her eyes. "I walked into that town alone for 10 years, he said. "I was the savage, the killer. I never cared what they thought. But today, when they looked at you, I wanted to burn the whole place down. Not because I was ashamed of you, but because you are worth 10 of Mrs. Gable, and they are too blind to see it." He took a breath. "If you ever choose to stand in front of them and say your name, if you ever choose to tell them what Baird did, I will stand right beside you, and any man who calls you less than a lady will answer to me." Lena felt a heat bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a profound, aching gratitude, mixed with something sharper. She looked at him, the firelight catching the gray in his beard, the steady strength of his hands, the fierce loyalty in his eyes. She realized then, with a jolt that nearly knocked the wind out of her, that she didn't just feel safe with him. She wanted him. She wanted to crawl across the small space of dirt and bury her face in his neck. She wanted to feel those hands on her, not just to save her from falling, but to hold her. But as soon as the thought formed, the old shadow rose up, the memory of the locked door, the memory of hands that took without asking. The panic flickered in her belly, cold and sharp. She looked away, trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. The next morning, the town of Granite Creek proved that bad news travels faster than a telegraph. Elias went into the saloon to ask about the rumors, leaving Lena at the camp with the rifle. When he came back an hour later, his face was thunderous. "It is worse than we thought," he said, crouching by the fire. "Baird?" Lena asked. "He has been here," Elias said. "Or his men have. The story is everywhere. He says he took you in out of charity. A poor widow. He says you were touched in the head. Hysterical. He says you stole his mother's silver and ran off in a fit of madness." Lena gasped. "Silver? I took nothing but the clothes I wore." "The town believes him," Elias said grimly. "Because he buys the drinks, because he owns the cattle that feed the butcher. To them, he is a pillar of the territory. You are just the crazy woman who seduced the mountain man." "Seduced?" Lena laughed, a high, hysterical sound. "If they only knew. There is more," Elias said. "I spoke to the sheriff again. He pulled me aside. He says if Baird comes here, and he is coming, he will bring papers. He claims you are his ward, by reason of your illness, or that he has a common law claim." "He can't," Lena whispered. "The law likes paper," Elias said. And the law likes men with money. Grady says if Baird demands you, he might have to hold a hearing. A judge would decide. Lena felt the world tilt. A hearing. She imagined sitting in a room full of men like Henderson and the Riders, with Baird smiling his smooth, snake smile, telling them she was mad, telling them she belonged to him. They would believe him. They would hand her back to him like a returned parcel, and the law would call it justice. She stood up, pacing the small campsite. I can't go back. I would rather die. I will walk into the river first. Elias stood up and blocked her path. He didn't touch her, but his presence stopped her pacing. No one is walking into the river, he said firmly. He looked toward the mountains, then back at her. We have a choice, Lena, a hard one. He pointed north, toward the deep wilderness where the peaks were still white. We can pack up now, right now. We rode deep, past the trap lines, into the Yukon territory if we have to. We disappear. We live wild. No law, no town, no Baird. Just survival. It will be hard. It will be cold, but you will be free. He dropped his hand and turned to look toward the town. Or, he said, we stay. We let him come. We stand before the judge in the town, and we tell the truth. We fight with him. We strip him naked with his own sins. It is a risk. The judge might be bought. The town might hate us. But if we win, you get your name back. You get your life back in the sun. He looked at her, his eyes offering her the only thing he had left to give, her agency. I can't choose for you, Elias said. You tell me. Do we run or do we fight? Lena looked at the mountains, the safe, lonely, brutal silence. Then she looked at the town, the muddy, hateful, crowded place that held the possibility of justice. She looked at Elias, the man who was willing to lose everything for her, whichever way she turned. The wind rustled the cottonwood leaves, sounding like 1,000 whispering voices. Lena took a breath, tasting the dust and the fear, and made her choice. Silas Baird arrived in Granite Creek 3 days later, and he did not come quietly. He rode in at the head of a column of 4 men, his horse a high-stepping bay with a coat like polished mahogany. He wore a suit of fine gray wool that had been dusted but not dirtied by the trail, and his boots shone with a luster that seemed obscene amidst the mud and manure of the main street. To the people of the town, watching from behind slat curtains and store windows, he looked like civilization itself arriving to bring order to the frontier. To Lena, watching from the shadow of the livery stable where she and Elias had taken to spending their daylight hours to avoid the stairs, he looked like a nightmare made flesh. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, stripping off his kid leather gloves with a slow, deliberate grace. He spoke to the men gathered there, Mr. Henderson, the shopkeep, the blacksmith, the idlers, with a smile that was easy and practiced. He was the grieving benefactor, the wronged man, the patient guardian. Elias stood beside Lena. He felt the tremor start in her shoulder, a vibration so fine it was almost invisible. He is here, she whispered, the air leaving her lungs. Stand fast. Elias murmured. He is just a man. He bleeds like any other. Sheriff Grady came out onto the boardwalk, shaking Baird's hand. The sight of the lawman greeting her abuser with such respect made Lena's stomach turn over. Baird gestured toward the mountains, then to his heart, acting out a pantomime of concern. We go to them, Elias said. We don't let him set the stage without us. They walked out into the street. The contrast was brutal. Baird was clean, wealthy, and surrounded by nodding heads. Elias was scarred, wearing buckskin stained with pine pitch and blood, his hair long and gray. Lena wore her mended dress and the oversized boots, looking exactly like what the town whispered she was, a woman who had fallen off the edge of the world. Baird saw them coming. His smile did not falter, but his eyes, pale and flat as a winter sky, sharpened. Lena, he called out, his voice carrying effortlessly over the wind. My dear child, thank God. He took a step forward, arms open. We feared the worst. The elements, the savages. We thought you were lost. Lena stopped 10 feet away. Her body wanted to run. Her legs screamed at her to turn and bolt for the tree line. The old terror, the conditioning of months of captivity, surged up, making her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Sweat broke out on her palms. "I was not lost," Lena said. Her voice was thin, cracking on the last word. She swallowed and tried again. Louder. "I ran away. Mr. Baird. You know why." Baird's expression shifted to one of pitying sadness. He looked at the crowd, inviting them to share in his burden. "The fever," he said softly, touching his temple. "I see it hasn't broken." "Oh, Lena, the things you imagine, the paranoia." He turned his gaze to Elias. The pity vanished, replaced by cold accusation. "And you," Baird said. "Thorne, isn't it? I'm told you found her, and yet, instead of bringing a sick, confused woman to the safety of the town, you kept her, hide her in the high peaks like stolen property. Did you take advantage of her condition? Did you bewitch her with your mountain madness?" The crowd murmured. The narrative was seductive. It made sense to them. The wild man and the hysterical woman. "She is not property," Elias rumbled, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the sheriff. "She is a free woman who sought shelter from a dog who bites." "Theft," Baird snapped, his voice hardening. "She stole a horse, she stole silver, and she stole herself from my legal protection." "I took nothing," Lena shouted. The injustice of it gave her a sudden, blinding courage. She stepped out from Elias's shadow. "I took the dress on my back. I took a horse to save my life because you locked me in that room. You kept me there for weeks. You came in at night." She faltered, the shame of it choking her. The crowd went silent. "You know what you did," she whispered, tears of rage spilling over. "You promised marriage and gave me a prison. You hurt me. You made me feel filthy." Mrs. Gable, standing near the mercantile, turned her face away with a sniff. "Such things shouldn't be spoken of in the street," she muttered to her neighbor. If she was a lady, she would have died of shame before shouting it to the world. Baird sighed, shaking his head. "You see? Hysteria. I treated her with nothing but kindness. I offered her a home. She repays me with slander." He reached into his coat and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Sheriff," Baird said. "These are the documents of indenture. She owes her passage. She owes her board. By law. She is under my supervision until the debt is paid." Grady took the papers. He looked at them, squinting in the sunlight. They looked official. They were stamps, signatures. "It looks in order," Grady said, though he looked unhappy. "Thorne, have you got anything written? Any proof of what she says?" "I have her word," Elias said. "And I have the bruises I saw on her skin when I found her. Bruises from the wreck," Baird interjected smoothly. "From her own clumsiness." It is her word against his paper," Grady said, handing the documents back. "I can't ignore the law." "Elias, the law is blind if it can't see a snake in a suit." Elias spat. Grady held up a hand. "Enough. I won't hand her over on the street like a sack of grain. But I can't let her go back up the mountain either. Not with a theft accusation and a debt claim. We will hold a hearing. The day after tomorrow, the circuit judge is due in. We will let him decide." "She stays in town," Baird demanded. "She stays in town," Grady agreed. "But not with you, Mr. Baird, and not with Thorne. She stays at the widow's boarding house. I will pay the rate myself if I have to." Baird smiled, a tight, victorious curving of his lips. "Acceptable, for now." He looked at Lena one last time, a look of possessive hunger that made her blood run cold, then turned and walked into the saloon, his men trailing behind him. That night, the town was uneasy. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying the scent of dust and impending violence. Elias did not sleep. He paced the alley behind the livery stable, smoking his pipe. He had been barred from the boarding house where Lena was locked in for her own safety. He felt useless, a feeling he despised. He turned the corner to head toward the river, intending to wash the taste of the day from his mouth. They were waiting for him. 3 shadows detached themselves from the darkness of the mercantile's loading dock. It was Baird's men. They didn't have guns drawn. That would be too loud. They held axe handles and a heavy length of chain. Mr. Baird sends his regards, the biggest one said. Elias didn't waste breath on words. He threw his pipe in the first man's face, a shower of sparks, and lunged. He fought with the ferocity of a trapped cougar. He broke the nose of the first man with a palm strike that sounded like a cracking branch. He kicked the second man in the knee, shattering the joint, but he was 50 years old, tired, and outnumbered. The third man swung the axe handle. It caught Elias across the ribs with a sickening thud. The breath left him in a rush. He went down to one knee. The chain swung out of the dark, catching him across the temple, splitting the skin. They didn't kill him. That would bring the sheriff. They beat him with a cold, professional efficiency. They kicked his ribs. They stomped on his hands, the hands that set traps, the hands that had held a rifle for the Union. "Leave the girl be," the leader hissed, leaning over Elias's prone form. "Go back to your rocks, old man. Accidents happen in the mountains. Next time, we won't stop." They left him bleeding in the mud, the taste of copper and dirt filling his mouth. Lena found him an hour later. She had slipped out of the boarding house window, risking her reputation and the sheriff's wrath because she had a feeling, a dark, twisting knot in her gut, that something was wrong. She found him trying to drag himself into the shelter of the stable. "Elias!" The cry was torn from her throat. She dropped to her knees in the muck, heedless of her dress. His face was a mask of blood. One eye was swollen shut. His breath came in shallow, bubbling rasps that suggested a broken rib puncturing something vital. "Get back," he wheezed, trying to push her away. "They might be watching. Be quiet," she ordered, her voice fierce. She grabbed him under the arms. She was small, but adrenaline gave her the strength of two women. She dragged him into the empty stall at the back of the stable, hiding him in the straw. She ran to the water trough, soaking her petticoat, tearing strips from the hem. When she came back, she knelt beside him. "I need to clean this," she said. Her hands were shaking, hovering over his battered face. This was the test. This was flesh. This was touching a man. But looking at him, his gray hair matted with blood, his strong hands bruised and swollen, she didn't feel fear. She felt a surge of protective agony so strong it nearly doubled her over. This man had walked through blizzards for her. He had slept on the floor for months. He had taken a beating meant to break his spirit, all because he refused to abandon her. She laid her hand on his cheek. The contact was electric. His skin was hot, rough with stubble and sticky with blood. She didn't flinch. She wiped the blood from his eye. Her touch, feather-light. She traced the line of his jaw, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I'm sorry," she wept, the tears falling onto his buckskin shirt. "I am so sorry I brought this on you." Elias opened his good eye. He looked at her, seeing the change. She wasn't recoiling. She was leaning in. "Worth it," he whispered through split lips. Lena pressed her forehead against his uninjured shoulder. She cried for the pain he was in. But she cried for more than that. She cried because she realized, with a terrifying clarity, that she loved him. Not as a savior, but as a man. She loved his silence. She loved his stubbornness. And the thought of losing him to a man like Baird was a pain she could not bear. "We are going to fight," she whispered into his shirt. "We are going to kill him." The next morning, the sun rose blood-red through the dust haze. A boy came to the boarding house door with a note for Lena. It was signed by Sheriff Grady. "Come to the sheriff's office. Baird wants to parley. We can settle the debt without court." Lena hesitated. It seemed too simple. But if she could settle the debt, if she could get Baird to leave Elias alone by signing a paper. She walked to the jail. The street was empty. Too empty. As she passed the alley mouth near the saloon, a hand shot out, a rough, calloused hand that clamped over her mouth before she could scream. An arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. "Quiet now, little bird," a voice whispered. It wasn't the sheriff. She was dragged backward into the shadows. A horse was waiting. She was thrown over the saddle like a sack of flour, her wrists bound instantly with rawhide. "Mister, Baird is tired of waiting on the law," the man said, swinging up behind her. They rode out of town to the east, away from the mountains, toward the Badlands where the sagebrush grew thick and the wind never stopped. Elias woke in the stable to the sound of the widowed saloon owner, a tough woman named Martha, swearing softly. "Found him in the straw," she was saying to someone. "Looks like raw meat. Is he alive?" It was the voice of the young deputy, a boy named Thomas who had always been kind to Lena. Elias sat up. The world spun and went gray, pain exploding in his head and side. He fought it down, gritting his teeth until they creaked. "Lena," he croaked. "She is gone. Elias," Martha said, kneeling beside him with a flask of whiskey. "Mrs. Gable said she saw her walking toward the jail, but she never got there. And Baird's men are gone from the hotel." Elias grabbed the stall door and hauled himself to his feet. He swayed, nausea rolling over him, but his eyes were burning with a cold, deadly fire. "They took her," he said. "The line shack, east of the river. He wouldn't take her far." "You can't ride," the deputy said. "You can barely stand." "I will ride," Elias said, "or I will die trying. Are you going to help me, boy? Or are you going to let a slaver take a woman from your town?" The deputy looked at Elias, then at Martha. Martha pulled a shotgun from under her apron. "I never liked Baird," Martha said. "He cheats at cards, and he hits women. I'm riding." The deputy swallowed hard. He touched his badge. "This ain't legal, strictly speaking." "Neither is kidnapping," Elias growled. He grabbed his saddle. Pain tore through his ribs, but he welcomed it. It was fuel. At the line shack, a miserable, leaning structure of gray wood in a hollow of the dry hills, Lena sat on a crate. Her hands were tied in front of her. Baird paced the dirt floor. He had shed his gentleman's coat. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and his face was flushed with the heat of the day and his own agitation. "You forced my hand," he said, his voice tight. "I wanted to do this properly. A wedding, a nice house. But you have to be difficult. You have to run off with savages." "He is twice the man you are," Lena said. Her voice was steady. She was terrified. Yes, but the terror was cold and hard now. It was a weapon. Baird crossed the room in 2 strides and backhanded her. The blow knocked her off the crate. She tasted blood. "Obedience," Baird hissed, standing over her. "That is what you owe me. I bought you. I own the clothes on your back. I own the breath in your lungs." He reached down and grabbed her hair, hauling her up. "We are going back to the ranch, and you are going to learn to be a wife. If I have to break every bone in your body to teach you, I will." He dragged her toward the cot in the corner. "But first, we settle the matter of ownership." Panic flared, hot and blinding. He meant to rape her. Here, now, to seal the claim. Lena scrambled, her boots skidding in the dirt. Her eyes darted around the room. The fire pit. An iron poker lay in the ashes. Baird shoved her down onto the filthy mattress. He fumbled with his belt. Lena coiled her legs. "No!" she screamed. She kicked out with both feet, driving her heels into his stomach. Baird grunted, stumbling back. It bought her 3 seconds. She rolled off the cot, lunging for the fireplace. Her bound hands grasped the heavy iron poker. Baird recovered. He roared, lunging for her. Lena swung. She put every ounce of her fear, every month of her silence, every freezing night on the mountain into the swing. The iron bar connected with Baird's shin. There was a sickening crack of bone. Baird howled, going down on one knee. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats thundered like a storm rolling in. "Baird, come out!" It was Elias. His voice was ragged, weak, but undeniable. Baird cursed. He scrambled for his pistol, which lay on the table. Lena didn't wait. She scrambled backward into the shadows, clutching the poker. The door burst open. Elias stood there, swaying, his face a ruin of bruises. His rifle leveled. Behind him, Martha leveled her shotgun, and the deputy looked pale but determined with his revolver drawn. Baird's men, who had been guarding the horses, were shouting outside, pinned down by Martha's warning blast into the air. "Drop it," Elias rasped. Baird, kneeling, clutching his broken leg, raised his pistol. "She is mine!" he screamed. "No," Lena said. She saw the pistol on the floor where it had fallen when Baird was hit. Not his, but one of his men's spare guns. She dropped the poker. She grabbed the heavy revolver with her bound hands. The noise in the room was deafening. Baird fired. The bullet caught Elias in the shoulder. Spinning him around, he dropped to one knee, groaning. Baird grinned, leveling the gun for the kill shot. "Hey!" Lena screamed. Baird turned his head. Lena held the gun with two hands. She was shaking, but the barrel was pointed at his chest. "Drop it," she said. Her voice was the voice of the mountain wind. Cold, final. Baird hesitated. He looked at her, the woman he thought was a broken doll, and saw death in her eyes. He dropped the gun. The deputy rushed in, kicking the weapon away. Martha was right behind him, keeping the barrel of her shotgun trained on Baird's nose. Elias slumped against the doorframe, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked at Lena. He didn't speak. He just breathed, his eyes drinking her in. "Check the saddlebags," Lena said, her voice flat. She didn't lower the gun. "The brown horse, check them." The deputy ran out. He came back a moment later with a heavy leather book and a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. "It's all here," the deputy said, his eyes wide as he flipped through the pages. "Accounts, bribes, and letters. God, letters from a woman named Sarah in St. Louis, begging him to let her go, threatening to tell the law about the beatings." Baird's face went gray. "Get him out of my sight," Lena said. They rode back to town in a procession that was very different from the one that had left. Baird was tied to his horse, broken and silent. Elias rode next to Lena, though he was swaying in the saddle from blood loss. The town came out to watch. This time, there were no jeers. The sight of the mountain man, beaten half to death but still riding, and the woman with her wrists chafed and a gun in her belt, silenced the gossip. Sheriff Grady met them at the jail. He looked at the letters the deputy handed him. He looked at Baird. "Silas Baird," Grady said, his voice heavy with disgust. "I am arresting you for kidnapping, assault, and fraud." Baird was dragged into a cell. The sound of the iron door clanging shut was the sweetest sound Lena had ever heard. That night, the adrenaline crashed. Martha gave them a room in a small building behind the saloon, a quiet place, clean, with a sturdy lock on the door. A doctor had come to stitch Elias's shoulder and bind his ribs. He lay on the floor on a pallet, refusing the bed, insisting Lena take it. The room was dark, lit only by the moonlight coming through the window. Lena lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. She was exhausted, her body aching from the ride and the fight, but she felt light. The weight she had carried for a year was gone. She turned her head. "Elias?" "I am here," he whispered from the floor. "The floor is hard," she said. "I am used to it." "I am not asking about your comfort," she said softly. "I am asking you to come here." Silence stretched in the room. "Lena," Elias said, his voice strained, "you have had a hard day. You don't need—" "I know what I need," she interrupted. She sat up. "I held a gun today. Elias, I broke a man's leg. I am not a child, and I am not a victim anymore." She took a breath. "I want to reclaim the rest of me, my body. It has been a place of fear for too long. I want it to be a place of us." Elias stood up slowly, groaning as his ribs protested. He walked to the side of the bed. He stood there, a dark shape in the moonlight. "I am afraid," Lena admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I trust you. More than anyone on this earth. You set the pace," Elias said. "You tell me when." He sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight. Lena reached out. She took his hand, the hand that had been stomped on, the hand that had built her fires. She pulled it toward her. She placed his palm against her cheek. She closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. "Touch me," she whispered. "Please." He moved with agonizing slowness. His fingers traced the line of her jaw. Rough skin against smooth. He brushed a stray hair from her forehead. His touch was reverent, asking a question with every movement. "Is this okay? Is this safe?" She nodded, a small movement against his hand. He leaned in. He kissed her forehead first, then her cheek, and finally, her lips. It wasn't a kiss of hunger, though the hunger was there, burning deep. It was a kiss of sealing a promise. It was soft, hesitant, giving her 1,000 chances to pull away. She didn't pull away. She reached up, wrapping her arms around his neck, careful of his wound. She pulled him closer. The darkness of the room became a sanctuary. For the first time, the touch of a man didn't make her think of locked doors. It made her think of open skies. It made her think of the wind in the pines. It made her think of home. "Elias," she breathed against his mouth. "I am here," he answered. "I am right here." And for the rest of the night, the ghosts stayed outside. The sun rose over Granite Creek with a clarity that seemed almost cruel, exposing every muddy rut in the street and every whispering face behind the curtained windows. The storm of violence from the day before had passed, leaving behind a quiet tension that hung over the town like smoke. When Lena and Elias stepped out of the small back room behind the saloon, the morning air was cool and smelled of wet sage. Elias moved stiffly, his left arm bound in a sling tight against his chest, his face a map of purple bruising and healing cuts. Lena walked beside him, her head high, wearing the same mended dress she had arrived in. They walked toward the livery stable to retrieve their animals. As they passed the boardwalk, the town awoke to the scandal. Mrs. Gable was sweeping her porch, her broom pausing in mid-stroke. She stared at Lena, at the unpinned hair, the defiance in her posture, and the undeniable fact that she'd spent the night in a room with a man who was not her husband. "Shameless," a voice hissed from the doorway of the mercantile. She held a gun. Another voice murmured, this one tinged with a reluctant awe. "Stood right up to Silas Baird." Lena felt the eyes on her. A week ago, these stares would have made her shrink, made her want to dissolve into the mud. Now, she met them. She saw the judgment, yes, but she also saw something else. The baker's wife, a woman with a perpetually bruised cheek, looked at Lena and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent salute from one survivor to another. Sheriff Grady met them at the stable doors. He looked tired, his hat pulled low. "Baird is in the cell," Grady said, spitting into the dust. "He is shouting for a lawyer from Denver, but the circuit judge is an honest man. With those letters and the witness testimony, Baird won't be seeing the outside of a prison for a long time, or he will run back east the moment he gets bail. Either way, he is finished here." "And us?" Elias asked, his voice rough. "You are free to go," Grady said. He looked at Lena, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Ma'am, the town council. Well, there has been talk. The Reverend's wife says there is a place for you at the women's home in the city. Or Mrs. Gable mentioned she needs a laundress, quiet work, service, a way to mend your reputation." Lena looked at the sheriff. She understood the offer. It was a path to redemption in the eyes of the town, a life of scrubbing other people's stains, of keeping her head down, of apologizing for the crime of having been victimized. It was a safe, gray cage. She looked at Elias. He was standing a few feet away, holding the reins of his mule with his good hand. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the mountains, giving her the space to choose. He would not ask her to come. He would not beg. He respected her too much to make her decision for him. Lena looked back at the sheriff. "I don't need a laundress job, Sheriff," she said clearly. "And I don't need to mend my reputation. My reputation is that I survived." She turned to Elias. She didn't wait for him to signal. She didn't wait for a private moment. In the middle of the street, with the bright spring sun illuminating every scar, she walked the 3 steps between them and took his hand. His fingers, rough and warm, closed around hers instantly. It was a reflex, a connection that went deeper than thought. A gasp rippled through the watchers on the boardwalk. To take a man's hand in public, to claim him so openly without a ring, was a declaration. It was Lena saying that she belonged to no one but herself, and she chose this man. "Ready?" she asked him. Elias looked down at her, his gray eyes crinkling at the corners. "The snow will be melting fast up high," he said. "Then let's go home," she answered. The journey back up the mountain was a mirror of the one they had taken down, but the reflection was reversed. Where there had been fear, there was now purpose. Where there had been silence, there was now the easy rhythm of two people who knew each other's minds. Lena rode the bay horse, the one she had taken from Baird, the one the law had returned to her as recompense for her unpaid labor. She rode with a straight back, her hands steady on the reins. She wasn't the terrified fugitive clinging to a saddle horn. She was a woman riding toward her future. Elias rode Moses, the mule complaining as usual about the incline. "You are favoring that side," Lena called out as they climbed the switchbacks near the tree line. "It is just a stiff rib." Elias grunted. "He is a stubborn man who won't admit he hurts." She teased. "We stop at the creek. I need to change that dressing, or you will get an infection and I will be left talking to the mule for conversation." Elias chuckled, a low sound that rumbled in his chest. "Moses is a good listener. He has better manners than some," she retorted, smiling. They reached the cabin 2 days later. Spring had laid siege to the high country in their absence. The white shroud of winter was tattered, revealing patches of dark, wet earth. The silence of the snow was replaced by the roar of the creek, swollen with meltwater. The willows along the bank were pushing out silver catkins, and the air was thick with the scent of pine pitch and mud. They walked into the cabin. It was cold and smelled of stale ash, but to Lena, it smelled like sanctuary. She set her bag on the table where she had first sat with a knife in her hand, terrified of the man who now stood beside her. "It needs air," she said, moving to throw open the shutters. Over the next month, Lena did not just inhabit the cabin, she claimed it. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was building. She took the heavy canvas sacks that had held flour and washed them in the creek until they were soft. She stitched them into curtains for the small windows, tying them back with strips of blue calico. It changed the light in the room, softening the harsh glare of the sun into something warm and diffused. She found a crack in the granite near the doorstep and packed it with river soil. She planted seeds she had bought in town, mint, sage, and chamomile. "They won't grow up here," Elias warned her, watching from the woodpile. "Frost will kill them in August." "Then we will enjoy them until August," she said stubbornly, "and I will dry the rest." The cabin slowly transformed. It was no longer just a trapper's station. It was a home. There were 2 chairs by the fire now, positioned so they could talk without shouting. There was a rug braided from scraps of old wool. There was a softness to the edges of their life. They spoke of the future in the evenings, passing the time as the sun lingered on the peaks. "Beaver prices are down," Elias said one night, looking at his ledger. "Silk is the fashion back east now. The trade is dying." "We have the garden," Lena said, "and the goats. If we get a few more nannies, we can sell cheese to the miners in the lower valley. They pay good money for fresh food." "I could guide," Elias mused. "There are men coming from the cities, hunters, geologists. They need someone who knows the passes, as long as they don't sleep in the cabin," Lena said firmly. "This is ours." "Agreed," Elias said. "I will make them camp in the rain." But healing was not a straight line. It was a spiral, circling back on itself just when she thought she was free. There were nights when the wind howled around the eaves, sounding too much like a man's shout. Lena would wake up gasping, her heart hammering, the old terror clutching her throat. The memory of the locked room, of Baird's heavy tread, would be so real she could smell his cigar smoke. On those nights, Elias did not try to hush her. He did not grab her. He would simply speak from the darkness. "I am here, Lena. The door is barred. You are on the mountain." Sometimes, during the day, a sudden movement, Elias raising an axe to split wood, or dropping a heavy pot, would make her flinch. She would recoil, her arm coming up to protect her face before she could stop herself. It was a reflex carved into her bones. Elias would freeze. He would lower his hands slowly, his face filled with a patience that broke her heart. "I am sorry," she would whisper, shame coloring her cheeks. "I know you wouldn't." "Don't apologize for the scar," he would tell her. "It just means you survived the cut." One evening in July, when the wildflowers were painting the meadows in riots of purple and yellow, they sat on the porch. The air was warm, filled with the buzzing of insects. "The circuit preacher is due at the crossing next week," Elias said. He was whittling a piece of cedar, the shavings curling around his boots. Lena looked up from her mending. "Is he?" "Martha sent word up with the supply boy," Elias said. "She said she and the deputy are riding up to fish the creek. Said they might bring the preacher with them if there was a reason." Lena looked at him. He wasn't looking at the wood anymore. He was looking at her, his gray eyes steady and open. "Is there a reason?" she asked softly. "I would like there to be." Elias said, "I am not a man for churches. Lena, you know that, but I would like to stand before God and the mountain and say that I am with you, if you will have me." Lena put down her needle. "I don't need a paper to know I am with you." Elias, "I know," he said, "but I want the promise. I want to say it out loud." They were married 3 days later. In the meadow below the cabin, Martha stood as witness, wearing her best Sunday hat and a pistol on her hip. The young deputy stood beside Elias, looking solemn. The preacher, a dusty man who smelled of horsehair, read from a worn Bible. It was simple. The wind played with the hem of Lena's dress, not white, but a pale blue calico she had sewn herself. When it came time for the vows, the preacher started the standard liturgy. "Do you promise to obey?" "No," Lena said clearly. The preacher stopped, blinking. "I beg your pardon. I won't promise to obey," Lena said, looking at Elias. "I did that once. It nearly killed me." She took Elias's hands. They were calloused, scarred, and big enough to crush her, but they held her with the lightness of a bird. "I promise to walk beside you," she said to him. "I promise to speak my truth, even when it is hard, and I promise to stay. Not because I have to, but because I choose to." Elias swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "And I promise to listen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise to stand between you and the wind, and I promise that you will never have to fear my hand. Then I pronounce you man and wife," the preacher said, looking a little bewildered but sensing the weight of the moment. Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "About time," she sniffed. Life settled into a rhythm that was as steady as the seasons. They built a lean-to for the goats. They carved terraces into the south-facing slope for a larger garden. One afternoon in late autumn, a year after Lena had first been found in the snow, a figure appeared on the trail. It was a girl, no more than 16. She was stumbling, her dress torn, her face dirty and streaked with tears. She looked up at the cabin with the same wild, hunted look that Lena knew better than her own reflection. Elias was by the woodpile. He reached for his rifle, his instinct to protect kicking in. "Elias, no," Lena said, stepping off the porch. She walked down the path. The girl flinched, looking ready to bolt. "It is all right," Lena called out. "You are safe here." The girl trembled. He is coming. My father. He said he would kill me if I left." "He won't pass the creek," Elias said from behind Lena, his voice grim. Lena reached the girl. She saw the bruises on the girl's arms. She saw the hunger in her eyes. "Come inside," Lena said. "We have soup and a warm fire." "I can't pay," the girl whispered. "We don't want your money," Lena said. She reached out a hand. The girl hesitated, then took it. That night, as the girl slept the sleep of the dead in the corner on a pallet, Lena stood by the window. "She is just the first," Elias said quietly, standing beside her. "I know," Lena said. "The world is hard on women, Elias, and there are so few places to rest." "Then we make this one," he said. It gave her pain a shape. It gave her suffering a purpose. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a harbor. The summer of their second year brought a heat that lingered long into the night. The crickets sang a deafening chorus in the tall grass. The air was heavy and sweet with the scent of blooming sage. They lay on a blanket on the flat rock overlooking the valley. The stars were a spill of diamonds across the black velvet of the sky, so bright they seemed to hum. Elias was lying on his back, his arm thrown over his eyes. Lena lay beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest. She felt a shift inside her. It wasn't the frantic, confused heat of the cave. It wasn't the desperate need for comfort of the town. It was a slow, deep current of desire that felt as natural as the river below. She moved closer. She placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. Elias went still. He removed his arm from his eyes and looked at her. The moonlight turned his eyes to silver. "Lena?" he asked softly. "I am ready," she whispered. He didn't move. He waited, letting her be sure. "I want you," she said, the words clear and steady. "I want your touch, and only yours." She leaned down and kissed him. The memory of her scream on the mountain, "I can't bear another man's touch," echoed in her mind for a split second. A ghost trying to assert its power. But then she felt his hand come up to cup the back of her head, his fingers threading through her hair, grounding her in the present. The ghost dissolved. Elias moved with a reverence that bordered on worship. He touched her as if she were made of something rare and precious. But there was a new weight to it now. He wasn't holding back out of fear of breaking her. He was touching her with the confidence of a man who knew he was welcomed. He traced the scars on her soul with his hands, and she traced the scars on his skin with hers. "You are beautiful," he whispered against her throat. "I am yours," she answered. Their lovemaking was not a conquest. It was a conversation. It was a reclaiming of territory that had been stolen. In the dark, under the vast western sky, they found a language that didn't need words, a language of skin and breath and shared hunger. It was fierce. Yes, because they were both survivors who had fought for this moment. But it was also incredibly gentle. When she cried out, it wasn't in fear, it was released. They woke at dawn. The sky was a pale, translucent pink, lighting the peaks with a fire that didn't burn. The air was cool, but under the blanket, they were warm. Lena lay with her head on Elias's shoulder. His arm was around her, holding her close. She watched the smoke from their chimney rise straight up into the still air, joining the clouds. The world down in the valley was still hard. Men like Baird still existed. Justice was still a rare commodity. But up here, on this ridge, they had carved out something that the world couldn't touch. Elias stirred, kissing the top of her head. "Morning," he rasped. "Morning." She smiled. She took his hand, interlacing their fingers. The scars were still there, on both of them, but they weren't open wounds anymore. They were just proof that they had lived long enough to find this. Lena closed her eyes, listening to the beat of his heart and the song of the morning birds. She was home. Thank you for listening to this story. I Can't Bear Another Man's Touch. It has been a journey of healing, resilience, and the kind of love that grows in the hardest soil. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment and let me know which part of the world you call home. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the American frontier. I invite you to share your thoughts on Lena and Elias's journey in the comments. Did their ending feel right to you? Until next time, keep your fires bright and your powder dry.